I'm delighted to be able to introduce Beverly Parish. She's the Managing Scientist at Exponent International Limited, a Fellow of the Geological Society of London and a Chartered Geologist with over 25 years of experience in industry and environmental consultancy. Beverly, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Well, I really enjoyed your presentation, Nick, because I'm a geologist, so I always find that fascinating. So thank you for that. Really enjoyed that. I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes on Exponent, which will hopefully explain why I think we have something to add to this debate. They are a team of around 1,000 scientists and engineers, primarily based in the UK, but with a growing business here in the UK and the EU. Sorry, primarily based in the US. Our clients are primarily major corporates. We do a huge amount of work in the oil and gas sector and, of course, in hydraulic fracturing. So, for example, many of the environmental science team at the moment are working on the Deepwater Horizon disaster, looking at the natural resource damage assessment, and our engineers are investigating the failure of that blowout. We were also within hours contacted around the Virgin Galactic incident. I'm hoping to get involved because I fancy one of those lovely red air hostess outfits, but I'm not quite sure I'm going to get onto that particular project. So, lessons to be learnt from the US. As has been pointed out, hydraulic fracturing has been going on a long time, both in the UK, the US, and around the world. We've been involved in many of the failure analyses that have taken place around the assessment of wellheads, casings, cements, and also determining the environmental impacts, real or perceived. And I think that's the real issue that I'm going to try and address here today, which is, what is actually a real impact and what is a perceived impact, and also how we go about determining whether or not it's a real impact or not, and where did that come from. So we'll be sharing some of the key technical findings from some of the work we've been doing in the US related to litigation, and looking at how this fits, if you like, into a UK context. What lessons can we learn here, and what things can we take forward? So clearly, these are all the issues that come. These are just a few, and I'm not going to cover all these off. I'm going to hone down on one specific one. We have talked very briefly about greenhouse gas emissions already, and I'm not going to go into that part of it, apart from to say that in the US, greenhouse gas emissions are at their lowest level since 1994, and this is deemed to be as a result of the use of fracking, shale gas, as opposed to other fossil fuels. So it's an important thing to remember, and Clive alluded to that earlier, and so did Nick. So it's additional evidence for that. There's a lot of conflict issues around land use, particularly in rural landscapes and national parks here in the UK. We're a much smaller place than the US. We're much more densely populated, and so we are going to have to consider very carefully about where we put these pads. But Nick, I think, had a brilliant point about the relative thickness of the shales here. We can get much more out of a single pad, we hope, than we can in the US, where, to be fair, lax regulation has allowed overdevelopment in certain areas, and we certainly wouldn't want to promote that here in the UK. Interestingly, the human health impacts, they have been very difficult to prove in the US. You have to prove causation, and there are very few links that have been developed at all that demonstrate that human health has been impacted by fracking in the US. One of the main areas appears to be the one that, if you like, where the litigation is actually getting some traction, is around noise and nuisance. So clearly, if you've got 100 wells within a mile of your house, you are going to feel that nuisance. It is going to affect you and your family's health, primarily from a loss of enjoyment of your land and property. And clearly, that's not an avenue that we want to go down here in the UK. Community impacts, obviously, as I say, the noise, air quality and traffic, all sort of above ground issues. I'm going to be concentrating on the below ground issues primarily, but in relation to water resources. So I've only got 20 minutes, so it is going to be concentrating on the potential impact, as say, the real and the perceived issues around water resources in the UK and what we've learned from the US. So, we've already seen these photos, gaslands. Again, this created a whole heap of hysteria in the US, and it did prompt the state regulators and the EPA and many other bodies to do vast studies to try and understand, well, what was real and what was perceived, what were the actual risks. And they initiated some major study programs. Certainly, as Nick's pointed out in the UK, and the natural presence of stray gases and hydrocarbons naturally occurring in the environment and cropping up in drinking water wells is actually nothing new. The US Geological Survey documented this in Pennsylvania drinking water wells long before they started developing the Marcellus Shale. It was there. Other contaminants, which are considered to be indicators of fracking, such as heavy metals, for example, also naturally occur in the environment and also naturally occur with rocks that we have here in this country and in the US. So background concentrations of heavy metals in the States, for example, are actually elevated above their trigger levels, and the same happens here in the UK. We can have arsenic in the ground here related to our coalfield deposits, which are above trigger levels, but actually they're perfectly naturally occurring materials in the soil because of the nature of the rocks that have developed those soils. So, as I said, in terms of litigation, what's happened in the US, few claims are actually successful. And it's primarily around nuisance and enjoyment of your property and land. And it's very difficult to prove causation. So the things I am going to talk about, the key areas of concern and what that means in the UK. Water use and availability, the sustainability of what people say are vast quantities of water that we're going to need. I'm going to touch on that. How sustainable is that? But what is the actual potential for contamination? Is it real? Of our water resources in particular? Is there potential methane migration from depth or from other sources? Determining the sources of methane. There's actually lots of different types of methane, and it's not all from a fracking source, and we're going to look at how you can determine the differences between the two. And the transport and fate of fracking fluids. Again, everybody worries about the chemicals involved in these fracking fluids. What's actually in them? How do they move through the ground? What is the potential for our aquifers to be contaminated by these? So this is a schematic. I like these because these are easier to describe. So going through these, the water acquisition, the resource availability, often voiced as a concern in relation to groundwater impacts in the UK. And I'll look at that in a little bit more detail in the next couple of slides. But if we look here, where is the potential for contamination in the typical fracking operation? If you look at number 2, you've got this, you're mixing your chemicals on the surface. Are they being stored correctly? Are they being handled correctly? Handling and use of chemicals prior to injection is a potential source of contamination. The well injection itself. Clearly people are worried about casing failure. I think I read that £3 million of cement and concrete went into an average well, and somebody will have to turn that into real money for me because I don't know. I work in metric, but that's a huge amount of structure and activity that goes on in order to protect surface groundwaters rather from the fracking fluids and methane migration up the drill pipe. So people are worried about that, but is that really a realistic concern? In the US, the Groundwater Protection Council came up with something about well cement failure rate of 0.01% in Texas and 0.03% in Ohio. So pretty rare occurrence for that to actually happen. People claim about injecting poison into our water supplies and all that sort of stuff. Well, clearly, if you are cementing your casing all the way through here, and you've probably got 3 layers of casing at least, again, very unlikely. Concerns over methane and fracking fluid migration from the propagation of fractures at depth. Again, very unlikely indeed. Your fractures are millimetres and you are hundreds of metres between the fracture formation and the aquifer at the top. And we'll be a bit more detail on that in a short while. Where there has been issues is the leakage of fracking fluids and flow back. And that's the biggest issue, I think. It's actually the disposal and treatment of the flowback is the biggest problem. And I'll tell you why that is in a little bit more detail shortly. So, quick look at water resources, and then we'll come back to contamination. Water resource availability. That's just some typical water requirements for US shale formations. Typically 2 to 4 million gallons, or 7,000 to 15,000 cubic metres. The flowback can be as much as 80%. So what you put down, 80% comes back. It can be a lot less, however, and it's all dependent on the geological conditions, the complexity of the drilling, and so on. Recycling is becoming more prevalent. The Marcellus Shale Coalition, which is an industry body, up to 60% recycled. They were a bit shady on whether it was reuse or recycled. You'll have to do some treatment, but eventually some of it has to be disposed of off-site, because you build up materials in the fluid, which reduces the efficacy of the actual drilling fluid and the fracturing fluid in the longer term. So this is just a bit more about that and what it looks like in the UK. This is an Environment Agency of agency map. So again, it looks like a lot, doesn't it? All these, thousands of cubic metres of water that we're going to use. I think the quadrilla pre-soil estimate was 9,000 cubic metres. But actually, in the grand scheme of things, that is really quite negligible. It sounds a lot compared to the total UK abstraction and, for example, what we use in leakage from our own water company pipes every day. It's actually not a considerable amount. I think where there is potential for an issue, if you look in these areas here, these sort of pale green, pale blue areas, or where water is available less than 30% of the time for abstraction under a new licence. So I think you're going to have to manage that carefully. Your local environment agency may have to restrict your usage in particularly water stressed areas, and in the future with drier summers, climate change, etc. You're going to have to think about that carefully. But I think one of the interesting points about this is that you're only going to use this water, these relatively vast amounts of water, for a small period of time. It's during the drilling and the fracturing phase. So actually there's potential to time that when water is more readily available. But as I say, in water stressed areas there may be little headroom, and I think there's a particular point here for anybody in the room who happens to work in the water industry or for a water utility. I think they need to be part of the statutory consultee process in order to make sure there's no potential impacts on our potable supplies or access to our potable supplies. So, potential for methane migration from depth. Is there this potential? And Nick's touched on this. Here's your, say, residential water well. There's your aquifer, the blue line. This is your shale gas formation. There's usually hundreds of metres of, sometimes usually, in fact, impervious formation in between the two. The fractures are highly unlikely to propagate, as I've said. They're very small. And the experience from the US shows that this is a virtually an unknown scenario. It's never been proven that this has actually taken place. You are more likely to get migration due to cementing or casing failures. That's what they're finding here. And in the UK, well, how close are our aquifers to shale gas formations? So this is a map produced by the British Geological Survey, and it shows, and this was in conjunction with the Environment Agency, where over on the red here is our shale gas source rocks, again not reserves, just sources, potential here, they're not actually going to be all drilled, and these are our principal aquifers. Where it's in the paler blue, those are the more shallow formations, or rather there's less distance between the two, if you like. But what's interesting here, in the UK, the Bowland Shale, which is sort of this area, is one of the principal source rocks and most important for shale gas development generally. But that's at least 800 metres below the principal aquifers from which we actively which are actively used as a source of drinking water. So the vast majority is 800 metres below that. So I think it's pretty unlikely we're going to get migration at that level. I'm a geologist. I just think it's nonsense really to think that that is likely to take place. You can get methane in groundwater, but it's not necessarily the methane from the fracked formation. And I'll show you some of the instances where we've found that in the US and how we've proved that it isn't. So in the US, we have found methane and other compounds in drinking water, but where did it come from? So, sources of methane. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but there are different sources of methane, there are different types of methane. So, down here, you've got what's called, by the way, this is just a isotopic plot, carbon versus hydrogen. It's a way of distinguishing, if you like, via chemical fingerprinting, if you like, isotopic analysis, the differences between types of compounds. So down here you've got a biogenic source. Biogenic methane is bacteria produced naturally associated with shallow anaerobic environments such as peat bogs, wetlands, and of course landfills. So if you can imagine you're in the Yorkshire Dales National Park and you've got a frack site and you've got methane, well, it could well have come from the nearby peat bog unless you're very clear about what you measured in the first place. So, and pretty much detectable in most groundwater in the UK apparently is methane. And a lowland study of 1,700 water wells in Pennsylvania found detectable methane in 78% of them. So it's common to find methane. It's just what type of methane have you got? So the thermogenic methane is this one up here. And this is coming from potentially frack formations. It's methane that's effectively formed from the thermal decomposition of organic matter, not the bacterial, at depth, under high pressure, and very typical of our oil, gas, and coal fields, basically. Over here, you've got something that they call in the US drift gas. This is also microbial methane, but it's from the it's from decomposition of organic materials at shallower depths, so you might get drift deposits or something like that, which produces that. And then you've got the mixed gas, and this is a combination of these. And what that mixed gas looks like can change over time depending on its source. So lots of variables, lots of different types of gas. And you can see on this plot, there's very clear differences between the different types. So if you wanted to do a baseline study, I wouldn't be doing total methane. I'd be doing what type of methane do I have? I mean, I think that's critical. It's critical, I think, for the industry to understand that and to future-proof themselves against possible litigation, regulatory scrutiny, and perhaps issues arising on permit surrender. But even with thermogenic gases over here, they've still got different signatures. This is the same plot again, but you can see here that these, well, if you've got very good eyesight, you can see here. This is the Marcellus Shale, and here it is over here. So this is like the frack formation. You've also got these thermogenic gases here, and they actually came from up here. They're from a different formation, not from the frack formation at all. So again, even within the thermogenic gases, if you do this correctly, you can tell where it came from. And I think that's going to be really important to understand your baseline. We've talked, Nick mentioned baselines before. I think that's absolutely critical to understand those. And we've done several studies like this in the US, and they can be. There's a recent Duke study that came out. In fact, you passed that on to me, didn't you, Nick? And they've actually backtracked because they were the ones who said previous to that it was all from the frack formation, and then found out that it wasn't. So, on to fracking fluids. Key concerns. I think we sort of hopefully debunked the myth that you can get migration of methane from depth. You can also debunk the myth that you're likely to get fracking fluids migrating from depth. But the primary cause seems to be of contamination from the fluids is actually in this area up here. There has been relatively lax regulation in the States, which has allowed these, if you like, these wastewaters to be stored on surface in either poorly contained or even uncontained environments, which obviously has allowed contamination to occur. This produced water currently in the US, we've talked a little bit about recycling. Yes, it can be recycled, but not indefinitely. It can be treated at wastewater treatment plants, but that is starting to be banned now in the US, particularly in Pennsylvania, because of a couple of things. One is norms, naturally occurring radioactive materials, which again, as it sounds, they are naturally occurring. You will get them anyway, so it's important to do a baseline study on your norms as well. And also total dissolved solids and salts. So this is actually where most of the contamination appears to occur, and it's poor management of these. How we'll dispose of it in this country, I don't know. Currently in the US, it's mostly deep well injection, and this material is a waste under the Waste Directive in the UK, and I suspect that won't be allowed. But I believe we have somebody from the Environment Agency on the panel, so maybe they'd be able to elucidate further on that one. So what's in this fracking fluid that we're also concerned about? Well, as you can see from this pie chart here, hopefully, the vast majority, over 90%, is water. We've got about 9%, which is the proppant, which is usually sand, fairly inert, and your chemical component is usually less than 1%. So not a lot. In addition, several of these materials in here aren't particularly of concern. They're not hazardous to health. Again, the Groundwater Protection Council in the US has deemed that these additives contained in these fluids present low to very low risk to human health and the environment, and a number of other studies have gone on to show the same thing. So, for example, state environmental protection agencies and other auspicious bodies, universities, etc. So these in themselves are not particularly hazardous to health. In the US, there's a website called FracFocus where you can, it's a voluntary thing, but basically the industry puts information on all their fracking fluids into this website, and it covers about 45,000 wells. I have to say, when you do look at it, it is quite generic, because they don't want to give away their intellectual property. And so it'll be interesting to see how we manage that here in the UK. I do know that the UK Onshore Operators Group have put this forward within their guidelines as something that they want to do. And I think we just need to be careful. We are saying we're going to be very open about what's going into the wells, then we are open about what's going into the wells, because we'll just come back and bite you in the bum if you don't. So that's a word of caution there. So, as I say, what is the biggest concern? It's not necessarily these chemicals, it's the flow back. It's the norms, it's the total dissolved solids, it's the salts. But the focus should really be on how we treat and dispose of those. And for us, I think it's going to be more difficult because we won't be able to do deep well injection. Last couple of slides. These are some common compounds that are basically, we've found in places like Pennsylvania, that occur as a result of common practices in rural areas, which are often cited, some studies have cited these as evidence of fracking operations. So, for example, you'll have heavy metals, diesel range organics, polyaromatic hydrocarbons or PAHs, but these could all come from, these can all come from septic tanks, burning rubbish, abandoned materials, abandoned cars. This happens in rural areas. It's making it sound a bit like Deliverance, actually, doesn't it? But anyway, but you know what I mean. You get this sort of thing going on, and these actually all present sources of contamination that some people say is a result of fracking, but actually it wasn't at all. Again, proper baselines are absolutely critical, and understanding whether or not that material has come from something like this, or it's got anything to do with fracking at all. And I've got a couple of examples, again, of how you go about that. We've talked about the chemical fingerprinting, if you like, the isotopic signature of methane, but you can do it for other compounds as well. So, for example, over here, this is saline. You often get a lot of what's called brines coming back out of the well. You know, there's lots of salts in there. If you look at this is a comparison of halogen elements. This is your well flow back over here, and this is your groundwater and septic tank, and this is your groundwater and rock salt. So you can actually see quite clear differences where this material has come from. PAH analysis. The ratio of two PAH compounds can distinguish between a petrogenic and a pyrogenic source, pyrogenic being burning, petrogenic being potentially something to do with fracking. So you don't just do total PAH, you speciate your PAH. It's some basics. This total dissolved solids one, on overpumping the well, what tends to happen is if you overpump the well, you get a lot of particulates come into the well, and your heavy metals absorb onto those particulates. And consequently, it looks like you've got a lot more heavy metals in your well than actually is typified your actual groundwater condition. So it's things like that that you have to be careful of. And you would, for example, if you've got TDS issues, you would analyse for both filtered and unfiltered. It's these sorts of fairly simple techniques, rather than just going blankly saying, I'm doing a baseline study, I'm going to measure methane, I'm going to measure hydrocarbons, I'm going to measure salt, chloride or whatever, but actually not doing it effectively, and that's where people have tripped up in the past. Their baseline didn't mean anything. And again, norms should be compared to background. We have naturally occurring radioactive materials here in the UK. That's very common. I mean, some of you, if you're in the property business, you will know that we look at radon in places like Cornwall, for example. It's been going on for years. It's the same here. These shales do contain these naturally occurring radioactive materials, and there will be a baseline. Actual violations in Pennsylvania, really, this is just a sort of proof of the pudding, really. This is the sort of things that have actually happened. It's all about improper management at surface. That tends to be where the violations have occurred. There hasn't apparently been one single proven case of groundwater contamination from methane or fracking fluids from depth. It's all been at this sort of level. And you see there's a blowout prevention one there, less than 1%. So it's where it's happened is it's poor techniques, poor management techniques, occasionally lacks regulatory control. But I think here in the UK, our industry and our regulatory environment, I think, means that these sorts of things are unlikely to happen. But we will still have to be vigilant. So in summary, contaminants cited as evidence of fracking activities can have other sources. Methane is not necessarily a thermogenic source. It might not even be from the frac formation. Other contaminants cited as fracking fluids, PAHs, salts, etc., could be from something else. Get your baseline right. It's really important. Effective delineation of the baseline is critical and for future-proofing of the industry. Key risks have been all around poor operational controls, rather than perceived risk of direct groundwater contamination. And really, I think, apart from appropriate treatment, disposal of flowback, and getting that disposal right, and hopefully some opportunities for recycling for the water treatment industry, our biggest issue that we have to come over is risk perception versus reality. And I hope that I have debunked some of the myths. Thank you.